In the next few slides, I'm going to respond to the questions that you submitted for assignment 12. So the first question on this first assignment sheet, I took the names off, so I'm not sure who these are. But the first question is one that a number of you asked about, and that has to do with how to identify the case particles 2, 4, and 7, since they have the same case particle endings. So basically, I would just recommend that you review Appendix 5 in the Joe Wilson book. That starts on page 623. And you just have to kind of keep reviewing the basic functions of each case, and gradually you'll get it down. So we'll go through some as I go through these assignments, and maybe that'll clarify some of your questions. So the next thing is, what does the shay at the end of a sentence mean? That's that line that comes at the end of a sentence. It looks a bit like that. That's just like marking the end of a sentence, but sometimes it marks the end of a phrase. So don't be misled into thinking that that's actually the end of a sentence. It's more the end of a concrete phrase in Tibetan. Sometimes you'll see two shays together. It's called a shay. Sometimes you'll see two of them, which marks the end of something that's really more like an actual sentence. The next one, for case 5, sometimes the ne or lay isn't actually a case particle, but it's a word. So you're right that lay can mean karma or action or work. So how do you know when they're used as case markers and when they're not? Basically, you just don't know initially, and you have to figure it out from the context of the sentence. So lay is a common word. Ne also has a meaning. It means barley. You don't see that so often, but lay we've seen as a word a number of times, and you'll just have to learn where you see the word in the sentence and from context whether it's likely to be a case particle or a word. It is tricky. Next, in English, a verb is used to describe an action. Is verb for Tibetan mean the same thing? What about the ending verb like yin? Is that still describing an action? So in English, we have verbs that are actions, but we also have verbs that are linking verbs like yin. So the verb is or to be is a linking verb in English. It's not really an action, but it's still a verb. So verbs in English and Tibetan in that respect are not so different, really. What does the case marking particle overall mean? How does it help in learning the Tibetan language? So case marking particles are, again, you could read Appendix 5 in Joe Wilson. They're ways of helping us understand how words are related to each other. So we have a verb at the end of the sentence, and we want to know what's the doer of the verb, what's the object of the verb, how are the words in the sentence related to the verb, and case marking particles help us know how to identify the words and their relationship to each other and the relationship to the verb. So most languages have something like case marking particles, or most languages decline their words in some way, and these are parts of grammar that help us understand how words in a sentence fit together and relate to each other. So finally on this sheet, the word ch means doctrine and dharma. So the dharma is a Sanskrit word that we commonly use in English, and it means the teachings of the Buddha. So in other words, the doctrine. So those are the same, it's the same word. You can use either one in this class. Okay, there's a couple of questions on this sheet also. So first of all, verbs of existence other than yu. There are a lot, and there are few, and if you look at page 261 in the Joe Wilson book, you'll see that some of the common ones are do, chi, da, and nga. Sorry, my writing it's a little bit hard to write on this screen, but you can see them listed on page 261. And then this person also says, go over case marking particles, and especially the objective, locative, and purposive beneficial. So again, I would review Appendix 5 to get an overview of the differences between those three in particular, but then also to see more about all of the case marking particles. That's the most concise summary of them in the Joe Wilson book. Okay, next. Another question about differentiating between the second, fourth, and seventh cases. Yes, I know it's difficult. It really is hard. And it's just something that with practice you'll become more accustomed to. So here's an example. Confused about whether the law in this sentence is second or seventh case. So one way you can know that is by knowing the class of verb according to Joe Wilson's system. So that's hard to know, but if you can figure it out, this verb che, to explain, for example, is the past tense of this verb che, and that's a class 5, which means agentive nominative verb. So that means the doer is in the agentive and the subject or the object is in the nominative. That doesn't really help you so much in this sentence. This sentence means that somebody explains the teachings to the ignorant or the childish. Chiba means, chiba nam is the childish or ignorant. And so there's the law. So the teachings are those, that's in the nominative, that's the object of the verb she. And the to the childish right here, it would be in the purposive beneficial because it's the children or the ignorant who are benefiting from the explanation of the teachings, right? So that's kind of a classic example of the fourth case. Here, this sentence down here, we've seen this. Ke miki sukla de, he looks at forms with his eyes. So with his eyes, this part, with his eyes is in the third case. He, the subject, is also in the third case. And this sukla looks at forms. What does he look at? He looks at forms. That is in the objective case. So that's the thing he's looking at, right? So the next example, the question here is, how is be, according to Nettle Unit 7, an example of the agentive case marking particle? So, da mi dakba yin be, dakba ma yin. So, because sound is not permanent, because sound is not permanent, it is not permanent. Because sound is impermanent, it is not permanent. Sorry, that's a weird sort of a sentence. It's not something that you would actually say in real life very often. This sentence comes from the practice of Buddhist logical debate in Tibetan. And so this is the kind of structure that you would see in a debate. But the reason this is a third case, and you can know this based on what you know so far, is that this is the means or reasons instance of the third case. So sometimes the third case is used to mark means or reasons. In other words, you would translate that then as because. And that is true in the sentence. Because sound is impermanent, it is not permanent, is the full sentence. And then at the bottom, this final question down here, different categories of syntactic particles are difficult to understand. So for syntactic particles, also there's an appendix that you can look at to review those. And I forget the number of the appendix right now, but it's one of the appendices in the end of the Joe Wilson book that goes over syntactic particles very clearly. So that would be an easier place to summarize, to look for a summary of that topic than trying to look through all of the chapters that you've read so far. Okay, next series of questions. At the top, a question about forms, verb forms. Some verbs have 4 forms and some only have 2. So there, if you look at page 615, you'll see in the appendix on verbs, which you should read because that's very useful, summary again, you'll see an example of some verbs that have all forms past, present, future, and imperative. Also on page 413, you'll see some examples of forms of verbs that have all four forms, but also where a verb where some of the forms are the same. So let me just flip to that page myself. 413, so you see the verb che that has past, present, future, and imperative where each of the four is different. But then you see the verb ze, in which past, present, and future are the same form, and imperative only is different. So some Tibetan verbs have changed in all their forms, and some of them stay the same. That's all that means. So the next question about these two words, lopma and loptruk, that's just two words for student. Not sure how to pronounce gya, that's pronounced gya. You don't say the R, it's silent. Unsure about personal pronouns. You listed first, second, and third, and that's correct, yes. And this sentence, you say, I'm not quite sure, there's not a case marker. So the Buddha, you're right, knows all objects of knowledge. So you're right that this is in the nominative and this is also in the nominative. So the nominative case has no marker, no marking particle. And so you're right, there's no case marker, but there are cases. So both of them are in the nominative. They're just not marked by any syllables. Next, another person asking about the differences between 2, 4, and 7. So yes, I understand it's so difficult. Review that Appendix 5 and just keep practicing, and you'll get it over time. And in some cases, it's actually not easy to know which one it is. And even Tibetan grammarians won't be sure which of 2, 4, and 7 it is. And so at a certain point, if you understand the meaning of the sentence, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's 2, 4, or 7. It matters to us now because we're just learning at the beginning, and in the examples that we're studying now, for the most part, it's easy to know which is 2, 4, or 7, following Wilson's system. But as Tibetan gets more and more complicated and advanced, it will often be very difficult to know, and in a sense it won't matter as long as you understand the meaning of the word. So syntactic particles, those again you can review Appendix 7, which starts on page 661. And then some more information about boxing. So boxing, basically the point of it is simply to help you understand what a word is. And so in this example, I would say this could not be correct and this would not be correct because the word is marikpa, right? So you wouldn't want to separate it like this because the pa is an essential part of the word, and same here, you wouldn't separate it like that. So if you were going to I would either do it like this to circle the entire word, including its case marker right there, or if you wanted to separate those two, you could box the word itself in its natural form, and then you could do a little indicator, a box around the particle if you wanted to. That's a little, can be kind of messy on your paper, so something like this would make more sense to me. And so the question, here, so no box on the case marking particles. Again, that's kind of up to you. It depends. It doesn't matter to me how you do that. The point is just that you understand that this would not be 6, but third case right here. So you could either put chu yi in one box and ku in one box. So it would have to be like that. So this is one word, and this is another word, or it's chu with a case marking particle. So typically, as in this example where you're boxing the word and its marker, in this case you box the word and its marker together. Here, explaining the double arrows, what this means in Joe Wilson's system is simply that this phrase right here is not finished. So it's continuing on here. The sentence is not over, and you have to keep reading to get the full meaning of that sentence. Next, another question about syntactic particles. So again, you could read that appendix that says a bit more about this. But basically, in this case, you have a verb that requires a syntactic particle with it. So this verb actually is easy for us to remember because in English we also require a particle or a word with. So to meet with somebody, we can say to meet somebody, but to meet with somebody is something that we would often say in English. And so in Tibetan too, some verbs require a syntactic particle like tongue or maybe something else to go with them. So how do you figure out what class a verb is? If you memorize Joe Wilson's system, then you would know the verb classes from that. Many people who study Tibetan don't use Joe Wilson's book, and so they would not know that system of verb classes. So when you go out into the world of people knowing Tibetan, you won't necessarily be able to speak to people about Joe Wilson's verb classes. The point is more to know that some verbs require certain types of case markers and cases and syntactic particles, and you need to learn that as part of the verb. So that's the point of kind of teaching you these verb classes. So in this case, you just would know over time and experience that this verb requires a tongue with it. So as for this question, po is both lexical and syntactic particle. I think if you look on page 662, you'll see an explanation of this as the syllable as part of a word, in which case it's a lexical particle. And if you look on page 666, you'll see an explanation of this as a terminating particle, in which case it would be called a syntactic particle. I think that must be what you're referring to here. So then this, you ask if it's in the seventh case. That's true because we have here a verb of possession, and verbs of possession always take the seventh case. And the next question, is this in the agentive case? Yes, even though it's not one of these five. The one that it is kind of this one. So if there's no, so the word lama has no suffix. So the ma has no suffix, right? It just ends, it's just a ma. And if there's no suffix, then you just add a sa onto it, and that makes it into the agentive case. So any word that has no suffix, the way you add an agentive marker to it is to just add a sa, like that. And the last one is the circled law in the second here. Objective case or beneficial case. So this would be in the fourth, beneficial purposive case, because the Lama gives the holy teachings to the students. So it's the students who are benefiting, right? So that's why it's in the fourth case. Okay, the next paper, how to find out the nominative in the sentence. I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but I think because a word in the nominative case has no marker, and so maybe you're asking how do you know when it's nominative. So it can be a little bit tricky because there are sometimes cases where a word maybe is not in the nominative, but the author has left out the case marker. So basically in the simple sentences that we have this semester, you know that it's in the nominative if there's no case marker, if it's a noun that has no case marker. Later on that will be more difficult. This next question, I'm sorry, can't read this word, so maybe write back to me and ask me that again. There are often some words in a sentence that have no meaning, but they're not case markers. How could we identify them? Some of those will probably be summarized in the appendix on syntactic particles. So maybe you mean something like the syllable ni, which is a topic marker. It's not a case particle. It's a word in a sentence. It has kind of no meaning, but it does indicate maybe like a colon in a sentence. It marks the topic of the sentence. Or there's a terminating particle like so, for example, or something at the end of the sentence that has no meaning really, but it indicates that it's like punctuation mark. So both of these are kind of like punctuation marks. You've noticed in Tibetan there are no punctuation marks like we have in English. And so Tibetan uses these syllables to indicate grammatical function or function of words in a sentence. So you learn these just by practice. Okay, here, these are the questions of 2 different students. And this first student, you're not sure. It's difficult to identify the case marking particles. And again, yes, it is difficult. And it just will be difficult for a while until you become more accustomed to Tibetan. So I think the fact that you're all finding it difficult is normal. It's just the way it is. And so just reviewing the appendix and practicing more and more is the way you get better at that. And then struggling with much longer sentences with multiple verbs, that's definitely something you're going to struggle with for a long time. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's still hard for me, even for some Tibetans. It can be very hard if there's a very long sentence of like many lines with many different verbs. It's hard to figure out how to put that together. And so tips on how to approach this is just something that we will continue to work on, especially next semester. That will be one of the main focuses of the course. Next semester we'll be reading an actual Tibetan text, and so we'll have to learn how to come up with some strategies to break down a long sentence like that. So that'll be really the focus of next semester. The next question, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by where the sa goes. The sa would attach to a word that's in the agentive case. The de, maybe by that you mean de can be a continuative particle, and you can read a lot about that on page 678. It can also sometimes be an appositive marker, and you can read about that on 672. So this is something that's it's very commonly seen. We'll probably see it more next semester and it's one of the key ways of breaking down a longer sentence actually is to look for the de. So these two are linked in that respect. Okay, again, this next question is something that we will address in more detail next semester. So sequencing is difficult to give you rules about because it is pretty flexible in Tibetan as to what type of phrase goes where and in what order. Of course, the verb goes at the end, but then where other things go can depend on the context in Tibetan, just as it can in English. So I can't really answer that question at this point, but it's something that you just have to keep noticing, keep an eye out for, and it's something we'll talk more about next semester as we have examples of longer sentences in context. And the same is kind of true for this next section. A review of pronouns I think you can find in the appendices, and honorifics is something we'll work on a lot more next semester as well. And Tibetan English dictionaries we will also start using next semester. And so if you can hang on to that question, I will give you a lot more detail on that at the beginning of our course in January. Okay, and the last couple of slides, a long series of detailed questions. Let me see. I think objective case, it's true that that's addressed later in the book. We won't get to those final chapters in the book in this semester, as you know. And we won't cover them directly next semester either. And so between now and January, or at some point in January, I would say you should you should study chapter 18 and 19. And in fact, the Joe Wilson book is something that you will be studying for years to come. I still find things that are interesting to me that I've forgotten in that book as I go through it myself. So all of these things, I couldn't possibly imagine that you would memorize the Joe Wilson book at this point. It's something that you'll be going back to again and again. Adverbial identity. When there's an adverb ending in a ra, I would personally call it an adverb. If you, for example, if you're asking strictly about the test, say, if you were to see an adverb ends in a ra and you called it an adverb, if I were to ask you to identify it, I would say that's a winning answer. So we can, at some point, start to be a little bit flexible as long as we understand the meaning of the word and how it works in the sentence as to what you call it in terms of Joe Wilson's system of grammar. Okay, so then the next series of questions, this sentence here, as causes of cyclic existence, the two actions and afflictions are needed. The easy way to respond to that question here is that you have ge, which is a verb of possession. And so this law has to be in the seventh case. So ge is a verb that takes a seventh case word. So in English, it's a little awkward to say the causes of cyclic existence need actions and afflictions. And so we translate that a little bit differently with this kind of phrase at the beginning. But the easy answer to that is to look at the verb and to know that that's a verb of possession. The next one, a question here about this ra. There's a discussion on page 636 about transformed identity, and that might help address what it means for this to be a case of identity, what Joe Wilson calls identity. This section here, this question is helpfully addressed on page 607. And verbs of attitude, I wouldn't worry about that too much yet. I think that's something that we'll come to later or that you can study on your own as you progress in Joe Wilson's system. On this screen, this sentence, Gendun la kyapsuchi o, I assume this must be a typo. It should be probably a terminating particle, kyapsuchi o. And if I said that Gendun la is in the fourth case, I would be wrong. This is a nominative objective verb, chi. And so this would be in the objective case, and this would be the purpose. So you're right, that's a mistake on my part if that's what I said in the video. And then as for these two questions from the Nettle sentences, no fourth particle and no seventh particle, you're correctly noticing that the particles you might expect in these examples are missing from these sentences. And the reason for that is that natural classical Tibetan simply omits many of the particles you might expect. So I'm sorry to reveal that. It makes it very difficult to read Tibetan, but the sentences that are presented in Joe Wilson's book as paradigm sentences are kind of exemplary sentences that would rarely be seen in real classical Tibetan writing. Some authors will write very nice classical Tibetan with all the case markers, and we are very happy to read that kind of Tibetan. But most classical Tibetan authors, most examples of writing in classical Tibetan will sometimes omit the case markers that you are hoping for. And so what we're learning in this first semester is a kind of a exemplary type of writing that includes every grammatical assistance we might hope for. But what you encounter when you're out there in the real world of reading classical Tibetan is often different than that, and things, markers and particles can be missing. So that's some of the sentences that you have are taken directly from in the Nettle examples, are taken directly from the Life of Milarepa biography that we'll be reading next semester. So this is real classical Tibetan, these sentences, but they're kind of more natural classical Tibetan than the examples found in Joe Wilson. Finally, the last slide. So chedu is a word meaning for the sake of, and I think that's discussed somewhere in Joe Wilson, but I couldn't find the page number. I would consider that just a word. Thank you, we'll correct that. And then these vocabulary words, yes, you may have seen the meanings of them in the hint, but I can go through some of them. So ni seba is, if you look that up, you'll actually see that in the dictionary, ni seba as a verb meaning to wake up. And sometimes you'll have the lay in there. It can be seen in either form. The next one, this word kopung means rank or position or level. So this sentence means although striving for the rank or position of liberation, or striving for the level of liberation, one does not attain it. The next sentence, this sentence means more than that. I or whomever, it is I will save the lives of animals. Here's animals right here. So the lives of animals by me in the agentive will be saved. So tsetar dongwa is a verbal expression that means to save the lives of animals. It's a Buddhist practice, sometimes called life liberation. Tsetar means life. When Buddhists will take animals that are found in the market and release them back into the wild to save their lives. The next sentence means the way to perform daily practice will be explained below. So here, the way with the topical marker ni, that's an easy place to start. When you see a topical marker, you start there and you read to the left. So the way, or how to practice, the mode of practice or the way of practicing daily is just an expression that means daily or in one day. Will be explained below. Okdu is below, and this is will be explained with a terminating particle. The next one is, what is the reason for the arising of this problem? The rising of this nyokdra. Nyokdra just means problem. The next sentence means, who is the inventor of Tibetan language? Puyik is Tibetan language or Tibetan writing. And this word, this is the verb to invent. And then when you add a po onto a verb, I think we learned this somewhere, that means a verb doer. So this is the verb to invent. And this makes it into a noun, a person who does it, an agent, a doer of that noun. And finally, len means answer or reply. So what is that answer or what is that reply?